By the end of the summer season of 2024, Naiad had been in the water for 2 spring seasons, 2 summer seasons and a winter season, and it was time to haul her out and take her back to her home ashore, where I could carry out some maintenance tasks that couldn't really be done while she was afloat. The standing rigging, now 7 years old and in very poor condition, needed to be replaced, and the mainsail luff reefing needed to be sorted out, since it frequently became tangled, which isn't a particularly good thing when you're trying to put in a reef underway. We set off one morning in early November, with the intention of getting Naiad onto her road trailer around high water, to have lunch whilst the tide went out a bit, and then prepare Naiad for the long trip home. Although the tide would be flooding as we moved Naiad from the mooring to the hard, and thus helping Naiad along, the forecast wind direction was going to make paddling her to the hard standing difficult, and from a direction that would make it very hard to sail up the Buzz'n Fleet. Instead, the plan was to sail out of the fleet, beating up the black water a short distance, and then into the Salcott Channel. From there we would sail up the Thorn Fleet before cutting across the channels to the hard standing. On arrival at the hard standing, we would put Naiad onto her road trailer, prepare her for the trip, and then drive her home. Well, that was the plan. The wind was strong enough in the channel for me to decide that a reef was probably a very good idea, so I put one in whilst we were still moored, which is by far the safest option, not having to heave to as would be required if it was still sailing. Then up with the throat, making sure the luff is fairly tight, and then the peak until a crease forms from the peak to the tack of the sail, and finally letting go of the topping lift to set the sail properly. After that, we could let go the mooring and with the dinghy towing astern, start sailing out of the Buzz'n Fleet. Unusually, this time the tide was coming in as we were going out, and there was little need to be careful to stay in the narrow channel. There was enough water to tack out of the channel had it been required, but with the wind from behind this wasn't necessary. So this time we sailed out and into the estuary proper with plenty of water. As you can see, there was not a lot of chop, and sailing in the channel was quite calm. However, once we got out into the river, it quickly became apparent that the wind was strong enough to require a second reef, so we hove to as soon as we could, put in the second reef, and then set off again for the Salcott Channel. Out in the river, the wind direction was slightly different from that in the channel, and instead of being on a beam reach up the river, we needed to tack a few times in order to be able to head up the Salcott Channel. The seas in the river were still quite small, but quite confused, not coming from any particular direction, and this is uncomfortable. It's not too bad if the seas are small, but if they get up, then the sail can become very unpleasant indeed. We only had to sail a short distance before heading in towards the land again, and we made good progress despite having the fairly heavy dinghy towing behind. This didn't help the tacking, and I had to resort to using the paddle a couple of times in order to push Naiad through the eye of the wind and onto the other tack. Soon we could see the line of moorings in the Salcott Channel, and it was towards these that we needed to head. Although the wind was trying to push the boat away from these moorings, the tide was acting in the opposite direction. And you can see from the buoys that mark the channel for deeper draft boats that our progress was quite good. And the closer we got to the land, the calmer the water became, although it remained quite confused. So it wasn't long before we got into the channel proper. From where we turned into the Thorn Fleet, we could see the rest of the moorings in the Salcott Channel in the far distance. The channel looks quite wide here, but the water close to the shore is quite shallow, and it remains shallow quite a long way out. Nevertheless, we sailed on the windward side of the channel instead of down the middle, for no other reason than I just wanted to. I think This is only the second or perhaps the third time that I've sailed along this channel, and then not in this direction. Previous times have been out into the estuary. The water here was calmer than out in the river, and we made very good progress up towards our destination. I wouldn't want to have a mooring out here. It's a very long row out from the Hard at the best of times, and at low water I would have to wend my way along the channels, sometimes in the opposite direction to avoid the mud, making it a very long row out indeed. And I can see why the club launch is so popular for people that have moorings out here. Still, our short sail was almost over, and soon we would need to head over to the shore where we could put Naiad on her trailer and wait for the tide to go out. Getting Naiad onto the trailer was more complicated than I thought, and I spent far too long messing about trying one thing and then another. I pushed and pulled, shoved and heaved, all to no effect. I could get Naiad's stern in position easy enough, but her bows just wouldn't go in the right place. In hindsight, and after looking at the video, I should have lowered the front of the trailer down a lot more than I did, so that the slope of the trailer matched that of Naiad's keel. It took a long time to get Naiad in position, and I only managed it because the tide rose far enough to allow the bows to be higher than the trailer, and at that point Naiad slipped into position. Then we heaved the trailer up towards the shore so that the remaining incoming tide wouldn't float her off again, and went and had lunch. By that time we both needed a break, so lunch was very welcome. After lunch, we moved the bedding and a few heavy items off Naiad and into the minibus. We took off the sails and the bowsprit, lowered the mast, and made Naiad ready for the long drive home. It was dark when we arrived, so it wasn't until the next day that I could take off Naiad's spars and store them, and then move Naiad into the shelter where she will spend the winter. There are a number of maintenance tasks to be done before she can be returned to her mooring once again sometime in the spring.